Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt coming to you from the offices of the Remnant newspaper. Wanted to have a little comment about the great tragedy this week, the burning of Notre Dame, but I first wanted to give you a quick update on this year's Pentecost pilgrimage to Chartres, which, as you know, always starts with a traditional Latin Mass at Notre Dame in Paris, and obviously that's not going to be possible this year. But I'm happy to report that our French allies and brothers are scrambling, even as we speak, to find an alternative starting point for the pilgrimage. I just got an email today, in fact, which says, "You can count on us for not giving up." And he says, "For sure, there will be an even greater pilgrimage this year." So those of you who are wondering if the French traditional Catholics are going to back down because of this, I can assure you they will not, and the pilgrimage will certainly take place. It's just a question of where it will start from. So that's the really good news tonight. And now we turn to the other news, the bad news. Notre Dame in flames during Holy Week. The most iconic symbol of Holy Christendom up in smoke, apparently. Like everybody else watching that unfold, I was holding back tears. I mean, personally, I've knelt on the floor of Notre Dame behind her great pillars and under her great soaring vaulted ceilings for 30 years in a row at the Pentecost pilgrimage. And to watch her burn like that, burned apparently to death, it was like, I guess it was kind of like a death watch, for an old or dear friend or a relative. And then, the next morning then to see her standing, to see Notre Dame still standing, it was like that old friend on the deathbed suddenly opened her eyes, defying all the doctor's predictions and so forth. So a very weird moment. There's hope now. Notre Dame is still standing. And there are a lot of questions. A lot of people want to talk about, how did the fire start? Who started the fire? I have no idea. Quite frankly, I'm not going to pretend to. I have no intention of rifling through, conspiracy theory videos on YouTube and then posing as an expert. I have no idea how the fire started. They're saying that it's an accident. Tell you what, I know I'm in the minority here, but I actually think the authorities in France may be doing the right thing here to downplay this Muslim possibility that it could be a Muslim extremist. Because to jump right to that, I wonder how wise that would actually be, to empower the terrorists like that. I mean, if it really was one of these fanatics that did the job that started the fire, and I have no idea if it was or wasn't, but if it was, I'd like to see him denied his 15 minutes of fame at Mecca, if you know what I mean. I'd prefer that this was an accident anyway. I think all of us would hope and pray that it was an accident and it wasn't a terrorist strike. And if that's the way they want to roll it before they know for sure, I think we should wait and see. And I know there are a lot of people, a lot of our allies, friends on the ground in France, traditional Catholics, who have a very keen vested interest in finding out how this fire started and what happened, much more so than we, Francophiles from across the pond do. So let's just wait and see what happened. Maybe it was an accident. I hope and pray that's what it was. I know France fairly well. I've traveled in that country extensively for many, many years. And again, we go there each and every spring for the Pentecost pilgrimage. And honestly, folks, the main problem in France right now is not the Muslim threat. I would say it's the Catholics who've abandoned their church, who've abandoned their faith, and who are really creating the vacuum through which the Muslims are coming right now. The Catholics are the ones who threw open the gates of Christendom now and let this happen because of their apostasy. And I really think, I believe with all my heart, that we need to concentrate on that. That is far more important. And of course, I get it. We understand this. We fight the open borders crowd, the George Soros clique, the New World Order rot every single day at the Remnant newspaper. But you see, again, the reason that George Soros and company, the reason that they can dare to do what they're doing is because former Christendom, former Catholic Europe, Catholic France, is pathetically weak right now. Weak because they've turned against themselves, because they're committing suicide in a sense by turning away from their animating principle, their great Christian animating principle, their soul, which is Christ. They've turned away from him.
Well, the fire you've just been watching is in some ways a metaphor, maybe, for the broader decline of Christianity in Europe. That decline has been swift and full of unintended consequences. Mark Stein has been studying this question for more than 30 years, and we're glad to have him with us tonight.
Well, Christendom is in retreat in Europe, and in France particularly. France has actually quite an aggressive belief in secularism, and according to some polls, the French are, even by the standards of the modern Western world, among the most godless people in that. And the French who were on the streets in tears this evening, on the streets of Paris, they're not mourning, I don't think they're mourning just history or architecture or art or culture. They're mourning something else. But what that something else, post-Christian France can't quite identify it. And that's really the conundrum. When Monsieur Macron says, oh, we're going to rebuild it for what? When people talk about, the heart of France has died, what is in the soul of France? What is this? Is it just a building or is it something more?
Hasn't made it a better society, the death of Christianity, I will say. I
No,
don't think anyone could argue that.
So the only thing that we can do to bring things back to sanity, the only way that's going to happen is through traditional Catholic restoration, which is what we're all about anyway. You know, we're not Alex Jones. We don't have investigating teams and Pinkerton cops running around. But we can look at the real crisis in France, which is a crisis of belief, which is France, the eldest daughter of the church, turning away and abandoning and forgetting the promises of her own baptism. That's the problem. In fact, I see the Muslim invasion at this point as a divine chastisement precisely for that Catholic apostasy that we all see unfolding. The revolution of Vatican II has done a great job in France. It did, in fact, what the satanic French Revolution failed to do. It failed to stomp out the faith. The French Revolution did. They tried to burn Notre Dame. They tried to burn most of the... It failed in France back in 1789 in the immediate aftermath. So today we've got a much bigger problem. Today we have a pope in Rome who is much more worried about climate change than he is in mass apostasy in formerly Catholic Europe. This is a huge problem. And again, it's a problem that we can actually fight. We can address it intelligently, and we can do something about it. So Notre Dame in flames was, it seems to me, a final warning for us all, not just for French Catholics, but for all of us, for Europe and for us all. And in a way of looking at it, there's a lot of analogies flying around right now and metaphors, but the metaphor of the sacred cockerel, the cock, the Gallic rooster, the great emblem of France, crashing down from its perch atop the 300-foot spire of Notre Dame, which then, as you saw in the video, inverted itself, penetrated the vaulted roof of Notre Dame, and plunged down precisely on the table altar below. The table altar, the great symbol of the Novus Ordo. You think that's a coincidence? I mean, that's got to, you guys, I mean, you know me, I'm not a signs and wonder guy, but that's got to be one of the most startling, right? Like startling signs that any of us have ever seen in the course of our own lifetimes. So this rooster, let's talk about that for a moment. A little rooster, the cock that sat up there high above Paris on that 300-foot spire. What is that? That's actually a medieval play on words, the Latin word gallus, which means either an inhabitant of Gaul or the rooster. So originally it was sort of a slur that would be shouted across a battlefield at French soldiers, by their opponents, by their enemies on the battlefield. But the Catholic kings of France, they seized on this idea of the rooster. They made the cock into the dominant symbol of French Catholicism. Not French nationalism now, but French Catholicism. And why would that be? Well, it should be pretty obvious. Here we are in Holy Week. The reason that became the symbol of French Catholicism was because it is the cock that crowed when Peter denied Christ the night that Christ was arrested. It's a beautiful symbolism. And it represents France's medieval pledge now of fidelity to Jesus Christ, that France, unlike Peter, would never deny Jesus Christ. That's why that little bird was sitting up on top of Notre Dame. And to see it go crashing through the roof, through the ceiling of Notre Dame in flames, yeah, it's a sign from heaven. But there's a twist. There's a twist to this obvious metaphor. The rooster, the French cock, it actually survived its fall. It's dented and it's and damaged, but it's restorable, according to the experts who found it. So it was found by this worker. We'll throw an image of him up on the screen. He's obviously very proud of his find. He found it more or less intact in the smoldering rubble below in Notre Dame. So maybe that discovery is another sign that there's still hope in France for the eldest daughter of the church. After all, France is home now to the most powerful traditional Catholic revival movement in the world today. So God was going to spare Sodom, as we all know from our scripture in Genesis. He was willing to spare Sodom. Remember, if only 10 just men could be found. So I would ask you, is it really so unthinkable that Notre Dame, Our Lady, would hold back the wrathful, vengeful arm of her Son one more time for the sake now of the tens of thousands of just men, traditional Catholics, who today are literally dragging the old faith back into prominence in Catholic France. The future of France is the traditional Catholic Mass movement, because most secular Frenchmen are no longer going to Mass. The Novus Ordo is literally dying in France. Not so of the traditional Catholic revival. So as you know, for the past, almost 30 years now, I've been leading the U.S. chapter on the Notre Dame de Chrétienté pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres. Now, why would that be? That's a long time. Pretty compulsive, unless there's a really good reason to go back over there every year to walk that pilgrimage. Well, it's because there's something happening in France in that movement. There's something huge happening, something capable of changing history, something which is already changing history. And by the way, nearly every French flag on that pilgrimage is adorned with the Sacred Heart, the Sacré-Cœur. Nobody sings the Marseillaise on the Chartres pilgrimage because that's a symbol, that's the anthem of the revolution against Christ. They don't celebrate July 14th, Bastille Day, these traditional Catholics. And again, they have the Sacred Heart on their flag, on the tricolor. Now, why would that be? It's because they remember very well that Christ himself told St. Margaret Mary Alacoque that France would be saved through devotion to his Sacred Heart. And the only way to save France now is for the Gauls, for the French to turn back to him. And the only people in France that seem to be aware of that now is this massive traditional Catholic movement. Someone just today sent me this vintage holy card, which I just found startling when I saw it. Kind of says it all. I'll put it up on the screen here. Christ pointing to his Sacred Heart with Notre Dame, the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, in flames in the background. Does that look familiar? So again, we see these signs everywhere this week during Holy Week, and we have to use this moment to reinforce this idea that the future of the Catholic Church, the future of the Catholic Church in Europe, in France, all around the world, everywhere, is the traditional Catholic restoration. We're not fooling around anymore. This is not about mass preferences, as I've said 1,000 times. This is about Catholic restoration. And you see it in France. I've seen it so many times. Why I go back, large Catholic families, taking over entire parishes in many places in France now. Armies of young traditional Catholic priests wearing cassocks and doing everything they can to bring the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional Catholic family life back to the fore in France. Even bishops, some of the most conservative young bishops in France right now, are ex-scouts, scouts who walked the road to Chartres on that great Pentecost pilgrimage. Politicians with an eye on the presidency of France walk that pilgrimage, one in particular, every year.
Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. You will the spark. It is now up to us to feed the conservative flame in our country.
The folks responsible for this So this is Holy Week that we're in right now. Easter Sunday is coming up. The resurrection of Christ, like the resurrection of Notre Dame, hopefully. But this is Holy Week, and we're reminded that the greatest heroes of our faith, the greatest heroes were simple people who stood silent at the foot of the cross. Well, they weren't shouting at the Romans. They weren't pointing fingers at the Pharisees and trying to get justice for them or justice for Christ because they knew it was his time. They weren't pulling their sword out like poor Peter did in the garden. They did something much more difficult. They refused to abandon Christ on the cross even when everyone else had. And maybe it's times like these when we have to remind ourselves of that little group at the foot of the cross, in the shadow of the cross, They started a movement at that moment that would lead to the fall of mighty Rome. Do you think they ever anticipated that or suspected that? No, of course not. They were devastated and destroyed, but they had faith in him. They had faith in the resurrection. They knew he was God, and so they stood there in the shadows of the cross and changed the world. So theirs is the greatest example for all of us now, the greatest example of Catholic action, sound, fundamentally Christian Catholic action in history. And they didn't say a word. They just stood there and they kept the faith in the darkest hour of human history. And now somehow we've got to look at them and we've got to figure out a way of doing the same. And maybe that's not going to be personal vindication. Maybe we're not going to be all that popular, just like they weren't. They were laughed at. They were spit upon. They had no power. But they changed everything through their faith and through their love. So maybe, friends, in this Holy Week, and I'm out of time here, so I'll wind up. But I think maybe this is what God wants us to think about a lot right now, at this moment, this terrible moment. Maybe this is why God put us on the earth in the first place at this particular time. Maybe this is why we were born. Maybe this is why we came into the world, so that we could make a difference in our own way, so that we could earn the right to be like the early Christians, the martyrs. Remember, our church rests on the dust, on the bones of martyrs, little ones who found a way to walk up the hill with Christ to the cross. And that's the greatest challenge of our lives, to think that maybe, if we can keep focused on what we're here for, maybe we can do something similar, or maybe we can make a halfway decent showing of it. Because these modernists that we talk about, and these Muslims that we fear, well, they're only going to advance as far as our apostasy permits them to advance. We have the means at our disposal to stop them if we have the courage to seize those means and make use of them. And a burned out Notre Dame, standing in a dark Paris sky now, is a warning to all of us. Come back to her. Come back to the old faith. Abandon the new ways. Abandon the new world order. Abandon the Novus Ordo. Go back to the old Latin Mass of Holy Christendom that Joan of Arc would have attended every day. King Louis IX, the old Latin Mass. Restore the old Catholic faith, or lose everything. Have everything Catholic burned to the ground. That's the option. That's what we face right now. And I think we need to use this moment to make a decision, with God's help and with Mary's help, to do the right thing and to go back to the cross. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great Easter. Christ is risen. Keep the faith, and we'll see you next week.